Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered why some people just can't seem to shake off a mistake or set impossibly high goals for themselves, especially when it comes to food and their bodies? Well, this new study dives deep into those feelings and how they might connect to eating disorders. Sometimes when we mess up, it feels like the end of the world, right? We might beat ourselves up, thinking we're total failures. That is what the researchers call concern over mistakes in this study. Then there is personal standards, which is about setting super high goals for yourself, often so high they're almost impossible to reach. Both of these are types of perfectionism, and they often go hand in hand with eating disorder behaviors. But how exactly do they show up across different types of eating disorders? And are they different from folks who don't have eating disorders at all? Or even those with other mental health challenges? That is the big question this research team wanted to answer. So, the researchers decided to look into this. They wanted to see if these perfectionism traits concern over mistakes and personal standards were different in people with anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and the group called OSFED, which stands for Other Specified Feeding or Eating Disorder. To make things even more interesting, they didn't just look at the diagnosis labels. They also looked at the behaviors people were doing, like restricting food, binging, and purging, or just binging. They compared these groups not only to each other, but also to two control groups, people with another psychiatric diagnosis but no eating disorder, and people who were completely healthy with no psychiatric or eating disorder issues. Now, we know that feeling anxious or down can really mess with how we think about ourselves and our goals. So, the researchers were smart and decided to account for anxiety and depression. They wanted to see if the perfectionism stuff was still a big deal even after you take those feelings into account. They basically wanted to know if the core problem was the perfectionism itself, or if it was more about how anxious or depressed people were feeling. To get their answers, they rounded up a bunch of people. They had about 100 people who said they had dealt with an eating disorder at some point in their lives. They also had about 25 people who had been diagnosed with another mental health issue, like anxiety or depression, but not an eating disorder. And finally, they had around 70 healthy control participants. It is important to note this was mostly a student and community sample. To figure out who was high on concern over mistakes and personal standards, they used a well-known questionnaire. It asks questions like, if I fail partly, it is as bad as being a complete failure to measure concern over mistakes. For personal standards, questions would be about setting very high goals and how important it is to meet them. They also used another questionnaire to measure anxiety and depression. So, how did they analyze all this information? They used some fancy statistical tools. Think of it like this. They first looked at all the groups to see if there were any big differences in their perfectionism scores. Then they did a second round of analysis, but this time they tried to cancel out the effect of anxiety and depression to see what was left. This helps them understand which factor is more powerfully linked to the eating disorder behaviors. Let's get to the good stuff. What did they find? First, looking at concern over mistakes, the fear of making mistakes and being harsh on yourself. They found that this didn't really differ much between the different eating disorder diagnoses or the different types of behaviors like restricting or binging. This is pretty interesting because it suggests that this tendency to really worry about mistakes and self-criticize is a common thread running through many different eating disorder experiences. However, there was a really clear pattern when they compared the eating disorder groups to the control groups. Pretty much all the people with eating disorders scored significantly higher on concern over mistakes than both the healthy controls and the psychiatric controls. This means if you are struggling with an eating disorder, you are much more likely to be worried about mistakes and harsh on yourself than someone who isn't. The only slight exception was bulimia nervosa, which didn't significantly differ from the psychiatric control group. This hints that while it is still elevated, maybe the connection isn't as strong in BN compared to other EDs when you are also dealing with other mental health issues. And what happened when they took anxiety and depression into account? Good news for this particular finding, even after controlling for how anxious or depressed people were feeling, the groups with eating disorder behaviors still scored higher on concern over mistakes than both control groups. This suggests that the worry about mistakes and self-criticism is a really strong factor, kind of independent of just feeling generally anxious or down. It is a core part of how these disorders might be maintained. When looking at specific diagnoses after controlling for negative affect, it was anorexia nervosa and OSFED that consistently scored higher than both control groups. This is a bit different from the earlier analysis where most ED groups were higher. It suggests that while the general tendency to worry about mistakes is present across EDs after accounting for anxiety and depression. Anorexia nervosa and OSFED really stand out in terms of this specific perfectionistic trait. Now, let's switch gears to personal standards, setting those really high goals. Interestingly, just like with concern over mistakes, the personal standard scores didn't significantly differ among the different eating disorder diagnoses or the different behavioral presentations. This implies that the drive to set extremely high standards isn't unique to one specific type of eating disorder. However, when they compared these groups to controls, things became a bit more nuanced. For personal standards, the binge-purge group didn't significantly differ from the psychiatric controls. This is a bit of a mixed finding, suggesting that perhaps in the context of other mental health struggles, this drive for high standards might not be as prominent compared to other groups. Looking at the diagnostic groups, it was anorexia nervosa and OSFED that scored significantly higher on personal standards compared to both the healthy and psychiatric control groups. This tells us that the tendency to set very high, perhaps unrealistic, goals is particularly strong in these specific diagnostic categories. Then came the analysis controlling for anxiety and depression. This is where things got really interesting for personal standards. After taking out the effect of anxiety and depression, only the binge eating group showed significantly higher scores than the psychiatric controls. Most other comparisons became non-significant, even though some had moderate effect sizes. This suggests that anxiety, in particular, plays a pretty significant role in how personal standards relate to eating pathology in many of these groups. And that brings us to a really important point, the role of anxiety and depression. The study found that anxiety symptoms significantly influence the relationship between personal standards and disordered eating behaviors. While depression was also looked at, it was anxiety that consistently popped up as a key factor. This is super important because it suggests that if someone has high personal standards and is also struggling with anxiety, that combination might be a particularly risky one for developing or maintaining eating disorder behaviors. So, what is the big takeaway from all of this complex research? The researchers are suggesting that both concern over mistakes and personal standards are relevant across pretty much all types of eating disorders. They're not limited to just one or two. This makes them transdiagnostic, meaning they cut across different diagnoses. This is the practical part. The study strongly suggests that when professionals are treating people with eating disorders, they should make sure to ask about these perfectionism traits. They should also be looking out for anxiety and depressive symptoms. Why? Because once you understand someone's specific mix of high standards, fear of mistakes, and their anxiety levels, you can tailor the treatment much better. For example, if someone has really high personal standards and struggles with anxiety, the treatment might need to focus on managing that anxiety alongside challenging those high standards. Now, like any research, this study has its limits. One big one is that it was a cross-sectional study. This means they looked at people at one specific point in time. They can tell us what is related to what, but they can't definitively say that perfectionism causes eating disorders. It is like looking at a photo. You can see what is happening in the picture, but you don't know the story leading up to it or what happens next. Another limitation is the sample. It was mostly young Anglo-Australian female university students. This is super common in psychology research, but it means we can't be totally sure if these findings would apply to other groups like older adults men or people from different cultural backgrounds. They also had small group sizes for some of the eating disorder diagnoses, like bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder, which means they might not have had enough statistical power to detect smaller differences. Also, they relied on people reporting their own diagnosis. While many people know their diagnosis, it is not the same as a formal, structured interview with a clinician. So, there is a chance of some inconsistencies in the diagnoses themselves. For example, the anorexia nervosa group had quite a few people with a BMI that wasn't underweight, suggesting they might have been partially recovered or had what is called atypical anorexia nervosa. Even with a normal BMI, they still showed high levels of disordered eating symptoms according to their questionnaire scores. Despite these limitations, this study gives us some really valuable insights. It reinforces the idea that perfectionism, particularly the fear of making mistakes and setting impossibly high standards, is a significant factor across a broad range of eating disorders, not just the ones we often hear about. And it highlights the crucial role of anxiety in how these perfectionistic tendencies translate into disordered eating behaviors. The main message is clear. If you are working with someone with an eating disorder, or if you recognize these patterns in yourself, it is really important to look at the whole picture. Understanding the nuances of perfectionism and co-occurring anxiety and depression can make a huge difference in how effective treatment is. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy can be really helpful in addressing these issues, and treatments that focus on self-compassion might also be a great way to counter that harsh self-criticism. It's about moving beyond just labeling the disorder and really understanding the individual's internal experience. It is a complex topic, and this research adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding eating disorders and the underlying psychological factors. We're moving towards more personalized and effective treatments, and that is always a good thing. What did you think of these findings? Do these descriptions of concern over mistakes and personal standards resonate with you? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more breaks into psychological research, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the fascinating world of the mind. Thanks for watching.